The crash of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 is the stuff that horror movies are made of: war, conspiracy, and international conflict. Unbeknownst to the passenger plane loaded with 298 civilians flying over Ukraine, there was a warhead missile directed straight at them. The events of that day would plunge a nation into a state of mourning that they hadn't endured in over a century. Here's the story of Flight MH17, the passenger plane alone in the war zone. Now, normally, we'd take a few minutes to go through the plane in question's maintenance history and each pilot's records to highlight any problematic points, but this time there are no blemishes to speak of. MH17 was in perfectly functional condition, all of the crew were up to date with their training, and none had any serious disciplinary problems to speak of. Today we're taking on a crash that has nothing to do with pilot error, no maintenance mistakes, no budget repairs, and no outrageous weather to lead an entire Boeing passenger plane to explode in the sky. No, this was a war crime through and through. On July 17, 2014, a Boeing 777-2H6ER rolled out onto the tarmac at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. The plane in question belonged to Malaysia Airlines, and they were headed back home to the city of Kuala Lumpur. The flight from the Netherlands to Malaysia would take just a little over 12 hours, so per Malaysia's protocol, 2 sets of flight crews were at the ready. The first crew would fly half the journey before the second crew were to relieve them of their duties. That way, all hands on deck would be refreshed and clear-headed throughout the flight. The first crew that would get them through the first leg of the flight included Captain Wan Amran Wan Hussein, aged 49, and his first officer Muhammad Firdaus Abdul Rahim, who was just 26 years old. Leading the team that would relieve them were Captain Eugene Chu Jin Leong, aged 44, and his first officer Ahmad Hakimi Hanapi, who was 29 years old. Both captains were very experienced behind the yoke and had squeaky clean records to prove it. Even their much younger and less experienced co-pilots were shaping up to be promising pilots in the future. Predictably, MH17 was booked to capacity. June to August in Malaysia is considered one of the busiest seasons in the year for tourism. 193 Dutch citizens were on their way to holiday in the tropical country, and 43 Malaysian nationals were heading home. And the rest were a collection of Australians, British, and citizens from the Philippine Islands and Indonesia, as well as the 14 crew members to take care of everyone. 2 of the Dutch natives were Senator Willem Witteveen and Joop Lange, former president of the International AIDS Society. An Australian author Liam Davison and rising Malaysian pop star and actress Shuba J, who was flying home with her husband and young daughter, were also present. All in all, MH17 had a total of 298 people on board at 12:31 local time. All was well and went as expected, but before we get into the events that would transpire just 3 hours later, we need to inform our listeners of the situation that was going on below their flight path. MH17 was scheduled to fly over eastern Ukraine, which was at the moment in the middle of a conflict between Ukraine's armed forces and separatist groups. We're going to avoid getting into the incredibly complex and varied history of Ukraine, since we are not a geopolitical channel, but we cannot avoid at least touching on the situation in Ukraine in 2014. It is, after all, the reason why Flight MH17 had to face such a devastating situation. In 2014, Ukraine was split in 2. On one hand, you had separatist rebels wanting to rejoin Russia, and on the other hand, you had the Ukrainian military enforcing order back into the fractured and chaotic nation. The Ukrainian army had contained the last 2 remaining rebel groups in the region of Donetsk, right on the easternmost side of Ukraine, just a few miles from the Russian border. These last 2 rebel factions were being supplied weapons by the Russian government. Among those weapons were missile launchers meant to bring down military aircrafts. These missile launchers would end up being the reason that you're watching this video here today. The suspicion was that Russia had supplied the rebels with a much more deadly warhead launcher than they'd previously thought. Specifically, the Buk-9M38 surface-to-air missile, a deadly missile responsible for shooting down an Ilyushin IL-76 supply plane that had 49 people on board just a month prior to MH17's flight. Now, the Buk missile isn't quite like a normal missile. It uses heat-seeking radar to hone in on the target it's being shot at, making it pinpoint accurate. It also doesn't explode upon impact. Instead, a trigger goes off when it reaches the target, at which point the missile explodes before impact. sending out hundreds of pieces of shrapnel designed to tear through even the highest grade of steel. It is one of the most deadly and destructive air missiles in the world today. Now you might be wondering why all the flights weren't rerouted to avoid the current conflict zone if planes were obviously being targeted. Well, the Ilyushin IL-76 was targeted just as it approached the runway, and it was not much lower elevation than any passenger plane would be if they were just passing over the country. It was believed that the missiles that the rebels had in their possession were incapable of reaching, or even getting their sights on, a plane that was 30,000 feet up in the air. The fact that the separatists even owned a BUK surface-to-air missile was only theorized, not even proven. Also, the rebels had no interest in targeting passenger planes, and any aircraft that were a threat to them were much more likely to fly well below that elevation. Nevertheless, as a precaution, a global notice was sent out that all aircrafts flying over that space must fly above 32,000 feet, just 3 days before MH17 was scheduled to fly over the region of Donetsk. All sides of the conflict, and the rest of the world for that matter, understood that every aircraft under 32,000 feet would be considered a target to the rebels. But when untrained rebel soldiers are expected to take command, well, it shouldn't be so surprising when trigger-happy soldiers who have no business operating military-grade weapons are going to disregard the rules. As proven after the 32,000 feet restriction was set in place, an Antonov An-26 aircraft was shot down even though it was well above the restriction zone after the rules were set in place. Unfortunately, since it was a military aircraft, and one belonging to the opposition at that, the situation was mostly overlooked, and it's probable that Malaysia Airlines and the Netherlands Airlines weren't even aware of the incident, or they most likely wouldn't have sent their planes over the area at all. Even after all this time, we still can't say for sure. All in all, nearly 24 planes, all Ukrainian supply or military aircraft, were targeted in the 4 months preceding MH17. On top of all those already concerning events and information coming from the Donetsk region, there was even worse news coming in on the morning of the 17th. Several witnesses sent reports of seeing a BUK surface-to-air missile being transported into the heart of the conflict zone to a farm field outside the village of Rabovo. The presence of that BUK proved that the rebels definitely had the capabilities to shoot down aircrafts from much higher up than 32,000 feet. Even though Ukraine knew about these reports and the cell phone footage taken by civilians of the missile as proof, they did not notify any airline that was cleared to use the airspace. So all the major airlines across the globe continued to plan their flights as usual, and quite literally, hundreds of planes passed over that airspace in the months leading up to the events of July the 17th. At 16:49 local time, MH17 had been in the air for approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. The flight had been rather uneventful thus far. The captain took them across the Dutch border, over Germany, and across Poland. At the same time that Husin was taking them over the Polish border, the rebels in Ukraine were setting up the BUK missile in an open field a few miles outside of the village. The sky had been clear and sunny all afternoon, but that changed when they crossed over Ukraine. When they entered Ukrainian airspace, Captain Husin requested to flight control that they deviate from their flight path by 20 nautical miles to the north to avoid some cloud formations ahead of them. Flight control approved the request since the area had been forecasted to have hail and thunderstorms that day, and the deviation was very minor after all. Since there were other aircraft in the skies on this new route, air traffic control told Husin to come back down to 33,000 feet to avoid collisions. This was still 1,000 feet above the issued restrictions, so they were still within the advised parameters. Just as Captain Husin passed the path of the storm clouds, he started the gradual rightward turn to get back to their original flight path. Just as he was about to get them back on their flight path, the separatists had completed the missile setup and were starting to scan the skies for potential targets. Minutes after they'd started searching, the men below saw an aircraft streak across the sky.
Николаевич,
4. Да, наемник.
Птичка полетела к вам.
Птичка к нам полетела?
Да, одна.
Разведчик или большая?
Не видно за тучами, высоко сильно.
Все понял, принял. Объявите наверх.
Coincidentally, there were 5 other passenger planes about to cross over the farm. MH17 just happened to be the first one. If the men below were just 5 minutes later to finish their setup, then they'd have spotted the Indian-owned aeroplane also filled to the brim with passengers, and if they'd taken just a few seconds to actually observe the plane above them, they'd have realized that this was not a military aircraft at all. But no, they saw the flash of metallic body in the sky, and with no confirmation from a superior, without going through any chain of command and with no second thought, someone pushed the button that released one of 4 warheads equipped with heat-seeking radar that flew at a speed of Mach 5 straight at MH17. There was no warning and no sound of surprise from the pilot's radios, because the instant that the missile reached the plane, it imploded, sending thousands of pieces of shrapnel through the nose of the plane. That blow instantly killed both Hussein, the co-pilot Muhammad Rahab, and all of the crew resting in their sleeping quarters. The front end was ripped to shreds, leaving a gaping crater where the nose had been just a few seconds before. From the sky rained twisted metal, burning debris, and human bodies that were streaking toward the ground. Some of them still alive but unconscious, due to the instant oxygen deprivation when the cabin depressurized in a fraction of a second when the front end was destroyed. When they saw the contents of what was falling to the ground, the separatists down below realized their mistake.
Короче, блин, стопудово гражданский борт.
Понятно. А этот, как и, народу много там?
Да пиздец. В обломки прямо во дворы падали тут.
Over 19 square miles of farmland was bombarded with metal debris, seats, ignited engines, and human bodies. Villages in the surrounding area saw smoke billowing from the fields, and many civilians took cell phone footage of the carnage. Most of them thought that there had been a bomb attack, or that the rebels and the Ukrainian forces had engaged in a battle in the farmlands. The missing plane was immediately noted as missing the moment that they got hit, and steps to get people into the area where it dropped off radar was outlined, and teams from Malaysia, the Netherlands, and the Ukrainian government were sent out to investigate the thousands of reports from witnesses now streaming in. But the separatists had blocked off all roads leading in, and they'd placed men around all of the sites where most of the debris was centered. If anyone dared to enter, rounds would be fired. But the reason for this had nothing to do with retaining the ground they'd won. It was all about buying time. An hour after MH17 was shot down, witnesses filmed a BUK surface-to-air missile being driven back across the Russian border. And even from the grainy footage, it was crystal clear. One of the 4 warheads on top of the tank was missing. Every country represented on that plane was all hands on deck, but none more so than the Dutch Safety Board. Those wanting to get onto that farmland to investigate the matter included military personnel from the Netherlands, Malaysia, Canada, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom, and they were all ready to locate and identify every victim and collect evidence to prove that this missile came from Russia. Unfortunately, it took 6 days for the rebels to allow any searchers or investigators to enter the region, and by that time, the wreckage had been disturbed and picked over by the separatists, and the bodies had been at the mercy of the elements for nearly a week. Finally, on the 23rd of July, the first bodies were brought into the Netherlands with full military honors. The whole nation declared the 23rd of July as a national day of mourning, and thousands arrived to pay their respects and lay down flowers, while the families of those victims that were still unaccounted for were waiting in agony to hear if it was one of their missing that were being brought back with the military processions that rode through the streets. Captain Hussein was laid to rest on what would have been his 50th birthday. In the months following the attack, memorials were erected and 298 trees were planted, one for each soul aboard MH17. In the end, only 2 of the 298 victims could not be identified. The unidentified were 2 crew members that were in the sleeping quarters at the left front side of the plane where the explosion occurred. It's thought that their bodies disintegrated upon impact. The rebels that were present in the field that day were never identified, and Russia has not admitted to supplying them with the BUK surface-to-air missile. We only have civilian footage of the missile entering the region with 4 warheads, as well as footage of it existing with 1 missile missing. Besides these, there is the shrapnel embedded inside the wreckage that matched a BUK warhead, as well as that 1 single intercepted radio communication that confirmed what had transpired.
Ну что у вас там?
Короче, блин, стопудово гражданский борт.
Понятно. А этот, как и, народу много там?
Да пиздец. В обломки прямо во дворы падали тут. Да.
Борт какой?
Да я еще пока не разобрался, то что я не был возле основной части. Я только вот смотрю там, где начали первые тела падать.
To complicate matters even more, this was the second major loss of life for Malaysia Airlines in just 3 months. On March 8, 2014, the infamous Flight MH17 had disappeared over the South China Sea. Undoubtedly, most of our viewers have heard of this bizarre disappearance of 239 people just vanishing into thin air. When MH17 was targeted in Ukraine, Air Malaysia was still sending out search parties to search for MH370. The intense public scrutiny on MH370 and the completely unexplainable circumstances that surrounded the whole affair took away from the immense tragedy that befell MH17. Except for the Netherlands, the rest of the world quickly forgot about a passenger plane falling victim to a civil war that it had no part in. Air Malaysia didn't encourage any remembrance either. Not surprising, since 2 back-to-back major disasters for a single airline company in just 3 months was almost unheard of at the time. Even if both incidents were not the airline's fault at all, the colossal amount of resources spent to investigate both of them nearly brought the airline to its knees. Not to mention the fact that the entire company was picked apart by aviation governing bodies and public scrutiny so intense that it led to a 60% drop in sales, costing them a further overhaul and rebrand of Air Malaysia on top of everything else. Predictably, internet rumors that the whole airline was cursed didn't make a rebrand any easier. Thankfully, that curse has not followed the company since their most disastrous year on record, as no more crashes or major problems have occurred since 2014. There was an investigation launched into 4 suspects, both from Russian military and from separatist forces, but the evidence is mostly circumstantial and no one's talking, so it's unlikely that anyone will ever be brought to justice to pay for what is clearly a war crime, not to mention a crime against humanity. Russia has denied any involvement, and outside a grainy cell phone video, there is no physical evidence to suggest that the warhead in question belonged to them. Or should the rebel forces be the ones to take blame for this horrendous use of a weapon deadlier than any of its kind? As we all know, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is complex and unlikely to end anytime soon. All we can do is hope that no more civilians have to pay the price for politics and centuries-old disagreements. The only thing the world of aviation could really do in the meantime is to tighten restrictions on passenger flights over conflict areas. Those policies and restrictions, at least, have been very successful, but it doesn't change the fact that 298 men, women, and children died because of war. A war that they had no part in. A war that they didn't even know was happening. As is always the case in any kind of conflict, it's always the innocent civilians who suffer the most.